All right, we are continuing our study through the Gospel of John here on the Listener's Commentary. And in this recording, we're going to be looking at John chapter 15, verses 1 through 11. The last line of chapter 14 is, "Get up, let's go." And then in John chapter 18, verse 1, it refers to Jesus leaving the city of Jerusalem, crossing the Kidron Valley, and then up the hillside and on into the Mount of Olives. And what that means is, as we come to John chapter 15 and on, we should probably picture Jesus and his disciples as on the move for the remainder of the scenes leading up to Jesus' arrest in chapter 18. Now, we don't know, obviously, the exact route he took or even where he went. And so when he talks about the vine and the branches here in chapter 15, verses 1 through 11, we're really not sure where he's at. One scholar, Gary Burge, actually speculates that he could have gone to the temple at night because Passover was the only time of the year when the temple doors were kept open all night long. And if that's the case, then, if Jesus is in the temple or went through the temple on his way out of the city, it's possible that this image of the vine and the branches was suggested by the temple itself, because in the entrance to the temple proper, there was a large golden grapevine that hung over and around the entrance into the temple. And so it's possible that Jesus is in the temple, that he sees the vine in the temple, and that is what leads him to share this image, this teaching with his disciples about the vine and the branches. But we don't know 100% for sure. What we do know is that the image of the grapevine had a long and sacred history within Israel. It was a way of picturing Israel as God's people, and sometimes in a very positive sense, sometimes in a sense of needing judgment. In fact, Isaiah chapter 5 is a famous passage of the Old Testament that actually uses this imagery. It's the Song of the Vineyard. And it reads like this. Let me just read the first two verses of Isaiah chapter 5. And if you want to read the rest, you can. But it goes like this. "Let me sing now for my beloved, a song of my beloved about his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill. He dug it all around, cleared it of stones, planted it with the choicest of vine. He built a tower in the middle of it, carved out a wine vat in it, and then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones." And then the rest of the passage there in Isaiah 5 goes on to basically talk about how God's going to judge his vineyard, that is Israel, for their worthless grapes, for their lack of fruit production, and how it's going to come as a consequence to them because of that. And so it's passages like that one and others that actually motivated Jesus to tell parables, for example, about a vineyard and a master and all of that, as a picture of Israel and their fruitlessness. And so this vine and vineyard theme pictures Israel as God's vineyard and God's vine. But Jesus here in John 15, 1 through 11, does something different, and something that's very important for us to notice. So look at John chapter 15, verse 1, where Jesus, speaking to his disciples on the evening of Passover before his crucifixion, Jesus says this, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser." Notice what Jesus has just done. In Israel, the vine and vineyard imagery pictured Israel itself as God's vine, sometimes even the temple proper as like the centerpiece of God's vineyard. But Jesus now moves the location of God's vine and God's vineyard from Israel and from the temple, and Jesus now locates the vine of God in himself. He's the true vine. He's the true vine, not Israel in total or Israel proper or even the temple, but Jesus himself is the true vine, and God, his Father, is the vine dresser. He's the one who takes care of the vineyard and takes care of all of the grapevines in the vineyard. Jesus is the vine, and his Father is the vine dresser. In other words, Israel has failed as God's vineyard, and Jesus is taking on himself the status and the role of Israel. Now, ironically, even though the Israel of Jesus' day looked with pride on themselves as God's vineyard, so much so that they would speak positively of their status as that, right? They would hang that golden grapevine in the temple to picture all of that. Most of the places in the prophets and the Psalm where the image of the grapevine shows up do so in context of judgment, do so in context of Israel's failure as God's vineyard. So it's nothing new for Jesus basically to say, I am now the true vine because Israel has failed. So Jesus is the new vine, the true vine, as Messiah. What Israel was supposed to be and yet failed to be, Jesus is. And God is the vine dresser. He's the one who's going to take care of this vineyard and care for the vines. Now, what does that entail? Well, look at verse 2. Jesus says, every branch in me. So he's the true vine, and you got individual branches attached to this vine. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he, that is God, the vine dresser, takes it away. So what you need to picture there is the image of a dried up, fruitless grape branch. For a grapevine to be as productive as possible, these old, dried up branches need to be cut off and removed every year. It was well known throughout Jesus' world and Jesus' culture because taking care of grapevines was just common. What Jesus says here then is every branch in me, that is, people who have maybe some connection to Jesus, have maybe some affinity or affiliation with Jesus and his people. That's the idea. Every branch in me, but they really don't have his life flowing in. They're not really deeply, intimately connected to him, so they don't produce any fruit. They're dried up as a branch. Every branch in me that doesn't bear fruit, they're like dead branches, and they too are removed. He takes away. God takes away. Now, what about fruitful branches? Well, Jesus goes on in verse 2 and says, every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it so that it might bear more fruit. Notice the objective of the pruning. It's to bear more fruit. And again, everyone knew that this was necessary for literal grapevines. So Jesus now says it's also true for disciples. Some things have to be removed so more fruit can be produced. And then Jesus says in verse 3, you are already clean because of the word which I've spoken to you. Now, we need to recognize that Jesus' thoughts in verses 2 and 3 are held together by a very simple and yet subtle bit of wordplay. So when he says in verse 2 that every branch that doesn't bear fruit, he, God, takes it away, the word for takes away is are in Greek. Then in verse 2b, when he says he prunes it, well, that's kath-ire. And then in verse 3, when he says clean, it's kath-aroi. So the words sound very similar in Greek, and that's what holds these two verses together. So when Jesus says you're already clean, it sounds like the word for prunes in verse 2. And what Jesus is essentially saying is that the pruning image of verse 2, it involves being cleaned as disciples. And the idea of that is that there are things in the lives of disciples, us, that keep us from growing or keep us from bearing fruit. They may have even been useful things in the past, or they may even produce some fruit in the past, but not so any longer. And so they need to be clean. And so Jesus says, you're already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. And so the tool that's used for pruning and cleaning is Jesus' teaching, Jesus' instructions, his words. And so Jesus' instructions to his disciples and them taking it to heart, that's how disciples are pruned or clean. Now, verses 1 through 3 are all descriptive. They all describe sort of this imagery of vine branches and Jesus playing off of that. But in verse 4, Jesus now moves towards some imperatives, some calls to action, and he gives really the key responsibility for disciples. Here's what he tells them and what he tells us to do. Look at verse 4 as a call to action. Remain in me and I in you. So 1 through 3 are all descriptive, but now we get a command, a call to action. Remain in me and I will remain in you. And the word translated remain is meno, and it means to dwell or to abide. And some older translations translate it that way. Abide in me and I in you. It means to stay connected or stay attached. And in the context of the image of the grapevine and branches, it means remain connected to the vine, namely Jesus. He'll actually explain a little bit later what's involved in that. But first, he makes it clear that remaining or abiding or staying attached and connected, he makes it clear that that's the secret to bearing fruit in the life of a disciple. So look what he says. Remain in me and I in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself, but must remain in the vine, so neither can you as a disciple unless you remain in me. In other words, like a branch can't bear fruit if it's disconnected from the vine, it'll just die, wither up, and be thrown away. Well, that's true with you. But if you remain in me, that's going to be necessary and key to producing fruit. So Jesus says in verse 5, I'm the vine, you're the branches. So in this imagery, Jesus is the true vine, and disciples are individual branches connected to him. Then he says, the one who remains in me, abides in me, stays connected to me, and I in him. So now notice that. We're connected to Jesus. Jesus is connected to us. So his life is flowing through us. So the one who abides or remains in Jesus and Jesus in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. In other words, union with Jesus leads to fruitfulness for Jesus. That's the key. Union with Jesus leads to fruitfulness for Jesus. And therefore, the aim is not so much to try to bear fruit. The aim is actually to arrange our life as disciples for attachment to Jesus, because the one who remains or stays attached to Jesus, he will bear much fruit. So to be attached to Jesus means his life is flowing into us and through us, and as a result, fruit happens. Now, what happens if a disciple doesn't remain attached to Jesus? Well, the same thing that happens to a branch that gets broken off of a vine. So look at verse 6. If anyone doesn't remain in me, so they maybe started in him, but they didn't remain in him. If anyone doesn't remain in me, he's thrown away like a branch and dries up. Just like a branch that gets broken off the vine, right, dries up and withers. And so you pull that branch out, you put it in the burn pile. Well, that's what happens. It's thrown away as a branch. They gather them up and they throw them into the fire and they are burned. On a grapevine, all the old dead branches or the broken off branches are gathered up into the burn pile. Well, so too with people who aren't connected to Jesus and then don't have his life flowing through them. And in the history of Israel, ample examples of this were to be found. So many people among Old Testament Israel were, quote unquote, part of God's vineyard, but they actually had little to no union with God himself. And it's still possible among people today. People can have some sort of general or loose association with the church, loose association with Christian people. Maybe they went to youth group when they were younger, or they grew up in a Christian family, but now they really have no vital union with Jesus. So they have a general or loose association with church. They may have some sort of nominal Christian belief, but they're not connected and remaining in Jesus, and Jesus' life isn't in them. And as a result, there's no fruit because there's no life. And that's the warning. That's the warning here. If anyone doesn't remain in Jesus, then he's thrown away as a branch. It's gathered up and put into the burn pile. But after Jesus gives that warning, he returns once again to the positive side of things. And in this last bit of the imagery, we see what remaining in Jesus entails. So look at verse 7. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. For disciples, remaining in Jesus involves Jesus' words remaining in us. That means taking his words to heart. That means absorbing them, praying through them, memorizing them, learning them, listening to them, doing them, taking them into our inner being so that they remain in us deeply. And as this union deepens between Jesus and his teaching and us, his words then will begin to govern our life. And it'll even begin to govern the things we value and want and desire, so that now our requests are informed by and shaped by Jesus' teachings and Jesus' values and Jesus' words. And as a result, the things we ask will be granted because they're actually in sync with Jesus' aims. Why? Because his words, his teaching, his thoughts, and his values, well, they remain in us. So as a disciple, remaining in Jesus involves Jesus' words remaining in us. And then Jesus goes on in verse 8 and says, "My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples." You want to glorify God. How do you do it? Well, you abide in Jesus. You remain in Jesus. As you do that, and as his words remain in you, now as life flows into you, you bear much fruit. Fruit happens because you're attached to Jesus. And if as fruit happens, that indicates that you really are Jesus' disciples. You're listening to and learning from him how to do life. His life is now being produced in and through you. Fruit now happens, and God gets glorified. And then Jesus says something incredibly meaningful and deep and profound in verse 9. He says, "Just as the Father has loved me, I also have loved you." Just pause. Reflect on that line for just a second. Just as. Hear that. The exact same way that the Father has loved Jesus, to the same degree, in the same manner, with the same depth, with the same commitment and the same affection, just as the Father has loved Jesus, Jesus has also loved you. And then he says, "Remain in my love." Notice we don't create that love. We don't cause that love. We simply remain in it, dwell in it, abide in it, stay connected and deeply attached to the love of Jesus. Remain in my love. And this remaining is again connected to Jesus' words and Jesus' commands. So look at verse 10. "If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love." Jesus had actually told them earlier this very evening, "If you love me, you'll keep my commandments." We saw that in an earlier recording from the Upper Room Discourse here. And the reason for that is because love for Jesus motivates obedience to Jesus. So remaining in Jesus' love leads to obeying Jesus' commands necessarily. We love him. We value what's important to him. We value his intellect and his knowledge about life. We realize that like this one really knows, and we love him. And because of that love, we're led to and motivated to obey his commands. And then at the end of all of this, one of the great benefits of remaining in Jesus and remaining in his love and remaining in his words and his words remaining in us and him remaining in us, this union between us and Jesus, one of the great benefits of that is joy. Look at verse 11. "These things I've spoken to you, so that my joy may be in you, and so that your joy may be made full." Notice that. Jesus wants us to have joy. He wants us to not just have a little bit of joy, but be full of joy. And he's just told us the key to that. What's the key to a life of joy? Remaining in Jesus and remaining in his love and having his words remain in us and having he himself remain and dwell in us. That's the secret to a life of joy. Joy is the outcome of all of that. If you remain in Jesus, not only does it lead you to bear much fruit, it leads to a life of great joy. And notice what Jesus says. It's not just any kind of joy, it's my joy. The very kind of joy that Jesus himself had. Now, this only makes sense if Jesus had a radiant and desirable kind of joy. He's been with these guys for 3 years. They've seen him in every kind of circumstance. They've been with him behind the scenes for 3 years. If Jesus didn't have a kind of joy that was attractive and beautiful and desirable, they knew it. And he couldn't have said, "I've spoken these things to you so that my joy might be in you," if he didn't have radiant, beautiful, attractive joy. And that means we should think about Jesus as overflowing with joy because he can't give what he himself doesn't possess. And he's promised them and promised us joy to the full if we abide in him. And so to wrap this whole section up, it boils down to this: remaining in Jesus to a life that's fruitful and a life that's joyful. Remaining in Jesus leads to fruit that's a benefit to others and joy for you yourself. And at the heart of all of this is this picture, this vine and branches picture, which speaks of union with Jesus, and then fruit bearing for Jesus, and then joy with Jesus. That's what really is all focused here in John 15, 1 through 11. That fruitfulness and joy will be the inevitable outcome of a deep spiritual life that's united with Jesus. And so we see here that Jesus, speaking on the very night before his crucifixion, he is sharing some of his last and final thoughts with these friends and men he's been with so long. And by extension, he's speaking through them to us today. What we see is the secret to a fruitful and joyful life is union with Jesus. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. Thanks a ton for making this ministry possible. And if you want to join the team of supporters to help this ministry continue to grow, reach more people, impact more people, to be able to provide things like transcripts on the website and even translate those transcripts into other languages and things like that, man, you could be a huge blessing and help to so many. And the easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and set up a one-time or recurring donation right there. Or you can sign up for the Study Hub, and that's another great way to support this ministry. So thanks a ton for your support.